Please, sir. I just need a warm coat for my mama. I'm sorry, Daniel said, his tone calm and polite. We're out of coats. The last one was given to a homeless boy about 10 minutes ago. The little girl nodded as if she understood that completely. Sir, there aren't any coats left at all? She asked. An old one is okay too. It doesn't have to be new. My mama needs it because her coat, there's nowhere left to patch it anymore. Daniel didn't answer right away. Behind him, a volunteer dragged a plastic bin across the ground. The church doors opened and closed as people carried the last boxes inside. A banner with the Whitmore Foundation logo moved slowly in the cold evening wind. Vanessa Whitmore stepped up beside her husband, adjusting her gloves. Sweetheart, Vanessa said gently, today's coat drive is finished. Everything we had was given out, but we're doing another one on Christmas Eve. A big one. If you come back then, we'll make sure you get a coat. The girl shook her head. My mama can't wait until Christmas, she said. Vanessa let out a small breath, the kind adults make when they have reached the end of what they consider reasonable. Well, then I don't know what else to tell you, Vanessa said. If there are no coats left, there's nothing we can do tonight. That's just the way it is. The girl looked down at the ground for a moment, then back up at Daniel. My mama used her saved money to buy me this coat, she said, touching the front of her jacket, so I wouldn't be cold when I walked to school. She said, kids get sick faster than grown-ups. Daniel noticed again that her coat did look warmer than the rest of her clothes. The zipper was new. The fabric wasn't worn thin yet. She still wears her old one, the girl continued. But it doesn't close anymore, and the wind goes inside. She says it's okay if she keeps her arms like this. The girl pulled her arms tight against her body to show him. So the cold can't get in too much, she said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a question he wasn't sure why he was asking. Why didn't you come earlier? He said. We were giving coats out all afternoon. The girl looked at him, and for the first time there was something like embarrassment in her eyes. I had to wait until my mama left for work, she said. If she knew I came here to ask for a coat, she would be mad. She doesn't like asking for things. She paused, then added quietly. She says we should only ask for help when we really need it. And now we really need it. The wind moved across the parking lot again. One of the volunteers closed the back of the truck with a loud metal bang. What does your mother do? Daniel asked. She worked at a factory, the girl said. Worked? Daniel asked. She got fired, the girl said simply, because she stayed home when my little brother had a fever. He was very hot. So she didn't go to work that day. And then they said she didn't have a job anymore. Vanessa shifted slightly beside him. There are shelters that can help with clothing, she said. We can have someone write down an address for you. But the girl didn't look at Vanessa. She kept looking at Daniel. She didn't do anything bad, the girl said quickly. She just stayed home because my brother was sick. She thought that was the right thing to do. Daniel felt something heavy settle in his chest. The girl stood there, small and straight in the cold, as if she had promised someone she would be brave and was trying very hard not to break that promise. So, there's really no coat at all? The girl asked quietly. Not even one people didn't want? Daniel shook his head slowly. No, I'm sorry. The girl nodded politely. Daniel should have left too. He had another event downtown, a room full of donors in suits and evening dresses, people who would shake his hand and thank him for caring about the community. His driver was already waiting with the engine running. His phone had buzzed twice in his pocket, but he was still standing there, looking at a little girl who had come too late to receive charity and had not complained once. Vanessa touched his arm lightly. Daniel, we really need to go. He didn't look at her. He was still looking at the child. Where do you live? He asked. The girl hesitated, as if she wasn't sure if she should answer that question. Then she pointed down the road, past the gas station on the corner, toward the darker part of East Harbor where the streetlights were farther apart. Maple Court, she said. The apartments near the factory. Daniel knew the place. Low brick buildings, cheap units originally built for plant workers 30 years ago. The kind of place people moved into when they were trying to hold things together and moved out of only when things got better or when they didn't. Do you have a car? He asked. She shook her head. My mama takes the bus. And you walked here? I walked some, she said. Then a church van gave me a ride when they saw me. Vanessa sighed softly. trying to keep her patience. Daniel, we can't start driving children around the city. If she needs help, we call a shelter or a community office. That's what those systems are for. The girl lowered her eyes when she heard the word shelter. Daniel noticed that. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a few bills and held them toward her. Here, he said. You can use this to buy a coat for your mother. The girl looked at the money but didn't take it. I can't, she said. You can, Daniel said. It's okay. She shook her head again. My mama said not to take money from people unless we work for it. This is a gift, Daniel said. She looked at the money for another second, then back up at him. If I take it, she'll know I asked, the girl said, and she'll be sad. That answer stayed in the air between them, not because she refused the money, but because she was worried about her mother's feelings more than her own cold. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support helps this channel bring more meaningful stories to people who still believe in kindness, justice, and humanity. And if you believe stories like this still matter, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Vanessa checked her watch. Daniel. He ignored the tone and asked the girl another question instead. What's your mother's name? Ruth, she said. And where did she work? Which factory? She hesitated, then said the name quietly. Whitmore Plant 4. Vanessa went completely still. Daniel did not react on the outside, but inside, something shifted into place like a heavy door closing. That's my company, he said. The girl nodded. I know. That's why I came here. Vanessa turned to him immediately. Daniel. This is not the place for this conversation. But Daniel was no longer listening to Vanessa. Who fired your mother? He asked. A man in the office, she said. She said his name is Mr. Pike. Daniel knew that name too. Gerald Pike, floor operations manager, 22 years with the company. Reliable numbers, low incident reports, the kind of man who never caused problems on paper. Daniel felt the cold again, sharper this time. She tried to explain about my brother being sick. The girl continued, but they said if she missed work, they would find someone else who wouldn't. She paused, then added quietly. She cried in the kitchen when she thought I was asleep. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. Daniel, we don't know if any of this is accurate. You can't just... But Daniel was still looking at the girl. What's your mother doing now? He asked. She's looking for another job, the girl said. She goes out every morning and comes back when it gets dark, but it's cold when she waits for the bus. That's why I wanted a coat for her first. I'm okay, because I have this one. She touched the front of her coat again, almost proudly. Daniel looked at that small hand resting on the zipper. And for some reason, he suddenly remembered his own mother sewing a button back onto his school jacket when he was a boy. Late at night at the kitchen table. He hadn't thought about that in years. Finally, Daniel spoke. Do you need a ride home? He asked. The girl looked surprised. You would take me? Yes, he said. She hesitated. It's not very nice where we live. That's okay, Daniel said. Vanessa stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. Daniel, think about what you're doing. This is not a simple situation. If something happened to that woman at work, it needs to go through proper channels. HR, legal. I know, Daniel said quietly. And you can't just involve yourself personally every time someone loses a job, Vanessa continued. There are thousands of employees. Daniel finally turned and looked at his wife. I know that too, he said. There was something different in his face now. He turned back to the girl. Is your mother home now? He asked. She nodded. She should be. Daniel looked toward his driver, who was standing by the SUV pretending not to watch but watching anyway. Open the back door, Daniel called. The driver nodded immediately and walked around the vehicle. The girl didn't move yet. She looked up at Daniel, uncertain. You're really taking me home? She asked. Yes, he said. I think I should meet your mother. The girl didn't move right away when the driver opened the back door of the SUV. She stood there for a second, looking at the car, then back at Daniel, as if she was trying to decide whether this was something good or something she would get in trouble for later. Vanessa spoke first. Daniel, you can't just take a child somewhere without even calling the mother. I'm going to meet the mother, Daniel said. That's the point. Vanessa lowered her voice, but there was steel in it now. You have a dinner in an hour. People are waiting for you. Important people. Daniel looked at her calmly. There's always another dinner. That's not the point. No, he said quietly. It isn't. He turned back to the girl. It's cold. Get in. She climbed into the back seat carefully, like she had never been inside a car this clean before and didn't want to touch anything she shouldn't. She sat on the edge of the seat, hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead. Daniel got in beside her instead of the front. Vanessa hesitated, then walked around and got in on the other side. Her posture stiff and silent. The driver pulled away from the church and turned onto the main road. The headlights cut through the early winter darkness, passing closed storefronts, a gas station glowing under fluorescent lights, and a bus stop where 3 people stood with their shoulders hunched against the wind. The girl noticed Daniel looking at the bus stop. My mama waits there, she said. Sometimes the bus is late. Daniel nodded but didn't say anything. They drove another 5 minutes before the buildings began to change. The streets were darker here, the streetlights farther apart. The houses turned into low apartment blocks, brick and concrete, built close together with narrow parking lots and metal stair rails painted too many times. Here, the girl said softly, pointing, Maple Court. The SUV turned into a lot with cracked pavement and faded white lines. A few cars sat under yellow lights. Laundry hung inside some of the windows. A television flickered blue behind thin curtains in one unit. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then stopped. The girl led them up a narrow set of stairs that smelled like old carpet and cooking oil. She walked quickly now, like she knew this place, and felt more sure of herself here than she had in the church parking lot. She stopped in front of a door near the end of the hallway and knocked twice. They heard movement inside, then the sound of a chain sliding. Then the door opened just a few inches. A woman looked out first with caution, then confusion, then immediate alarm when she saw the strangers standing behind her daughter. Her eyes dropped to the little girl. What did you do? She asked quietly, not angry, just scared. I didn't do anything bad, the girl said quickly. I just went to the church. The woman opened the door wider and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind her so no one could see inside. She was younger than Daniel expected, maybe early 30s, but the kind of tired in her face made her look older. She wore a thin sweater and, over it, a winter coat that had indeed been repaired so many times the seams looked like a map of old roads. The zipper was broken. One pocket hung lower than the other where it had been sewn back on by hand. She stood straight, though, and looked Daniel in the eye. Sir, I'm sorry if she bothered you, the woman said. I didn't know she went there. I would never send her to ask for things. She didn't bother me, Daniel said. She asked for a coat. The woman closed her eyes for a brief second, like the words physically hurt. I told you not to do that, she said softly to her daughter. I know, the girl said, but you're cold. The woman pressed her lips together and looked away for a moment before looking back at Daniel. I'm sorry, she said again. We'll manage. Daniel had heard that sentence many times in his life. We'll manage. People said it when they were already out of options but didn't want to admit it out loud. You worked at Plant 4, Daniel said. The woman's expression changed immediately. Not guilt, not anger. Something more like resignation. Yes, she said. I did. I'm Daniel Whitmore, he said. She stared at him, trying to place the name. Then her eyes widened slightly as she understood. Oh, she said quietly. You. Vanessa shifted slightly behind him, but she didn't speak. I was told you were fired for missing a day, Daniel said. The woman let out a slow breath. Yes, sir. Because your son was sick. Yes, sir. Did you call in? Yes, sir. I called the night supervisor. I told her I wouldn't be able to come in. She said she'd make a note. And then 2 days later they told me I was being terminated for unexcused absence, the woman said. She kept her voice calm, but her hands were shaking slightly inside the sleeves of her coat. I tried to explain. They said it was policy. Vanessa finally spoke. Company policy does require notice and documentation. There are procedures. The woman nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. I understand. I'm not saying I'm special. I just didn't have anyone else to stay with him. And he was so hot I was scared to leave the apartment. She stopped talking then, as if she had already said more than she meant to. I'm not asking for my job back, she said quickly. I know how things work. I just need a little time to find something else. That's all. Daniel looked at her coat again, at the broken zipper, at the careful stitches along the sleeve, at the way she kept her arms close to her body even in the hallway, just like her daughter had shown him in the parking lot. You spent your savings on her coat, he said, nodding toward the girl. The woman looked embarrassed. Kids get sick faster, she said, and she walks to school. There was a long silence in the hallway. The light above them flickered once, then stayed on. Daniel realized something then. All afternoon he had been giving things away, coats, food, blankets, and he had felt generous doing it. People had shaken his hand and thanked him and called him a good man. But standing in a dim hallway in a building that smelled like old paint and cheap detergent, looking at a woman who had lost her job because she stayed home with her sick child and then spent her savings to keep her daughter warm, he did not feel like a good man. He felt like a man who owned the building where the rules were written. He looked at the little girl, then back at the mother. May I come in for a few minutes? He asked. Ruth hesitated when he asked, her hand still resting on the door as if she could hold her life together just by not letting go of it. My place is small, she said, and it's not very tidy. That's okay, Daniel said. I didn't come to inspect anything. She studied his face for a moment, as if trying to decide whether this was some kind of test she didn't understand. Then she stepped aside and opened the door wider. The apartment was warm, but only just, the kind of warmth that came from a heater working too hard in an old building. The air smelled faintly of laundry soap and canned soup. A small lamp was on in the living room, and a cartoon played quietly on an old television. A little boy was asleep on the couch under a thin blanket, his face flushed with sleep. A bottle of children's fever medicine and a half-empty glass of water sat on the coffee table beside him. Ruth moved quickly to the couch and adjusted the blanket around the boy, her hands gentle and practiced. Then she turned the television volume down even lower. I'm sorry, she said again. Out of habit more than anything else. We don't get visitors. Daniel stepped inside slowly, taking in the room without making it obvious he was looking at everything. The furniture was old but clean. The kitchen table had 2 chairs that didn't match. There were drawings on the refrigerator door held up by magnets, a house, a sun, 3 stick figures holding hands. A stack of job application forms sat neatly at one corner of the table with a pen placed carefully on top. Vanessa stayed near the door, not sitting down, not taking off her coat. Ruth noticed and said, You can sit if you want. The couch is fine. I'll just stand. Daniel shook his head slightly. You should sit. You've probably been standing all day. She gave a small, tired smile but didn't sit. Instead, she leaned lightly against the back of one of the kitchen chairs. I don't know what my daughter told you, Ruth said, but I didn't send her there to ask for anything. I would never do that. I know, Daniel said. She told me she came on her own. Ruth closed her eyes for a second and shook her head, not in anger, but in a kind of quiet defeat. She's a good girl, Ruth said. She worries too much for someone her age. Daniel glanced at the boy sleeping on the couch. How long was he sick? 3 days, Ruth said. High fever the first 2. It broke yesterday morning. And you stayed home all 3 days? She nodded. I called the first night. I told the supervisor I wouldn't be in. She said she'd write it down. I thought everything would be okay if I came back the next day with a doctor's note, but... She shrugged slightly. They said I had already missed too many hours this year. Vanessa spoke from near the door. Most factories have attendance policies. They can't make exceptions every time someone has a family issue. Otherwise, the whole system falls apart. Ruth nodded immediately. Yes, ma'am. I understand. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying, sometimes life doesn't ask what the policy is. The room went quiet after that. Daniel walked over to the small kitchen table and looked at the stack of papers. These are job applications? Yes, sir, Ruth said. Warehouse, grocery store, cleaning service. Anywhere that's hiring. You have experience operating equipment? Daniel asked. Yes, sir. Packing line, inventory scan, some forklift training. But I never finished the certification. Daniel nodded slowly, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. Did you speak to Mr. Pike yourself? He asked. Ruth's expression tightened just slightly. Yes, sir. What did he say? He said if he made an exception for me, he'd have to make exceptions for everyone, she said. He said business can't run on feelings. Daniel was quiet for a long moment after that. From the couch, the little boy coughed in his sleep. Ruth immediately went to him, touched his forehead, adjusted the blanket again, then stayed there for a second, watching his face until his breathing settled. Daniel watched that small movement more carefully than anything else he had seen that day. "You spent your savings on her coat," he said quietly when Ruth came back to the table. Ruth looked embarrassed again. "It was getting cold," she said. "And kids shouldn't be cold if you can help it." "And you?" Daniel asked. She gave a small shrug. "I'm grown. I can handle cold." Daniel looked at the coat she was wearing. Up close, he could see how many times it had been repaired. Different colored threads, small patches cut from what looked like old jeans. The zipper had been replaced with mismatched teeth that didn't quite line up. "You can't handle that kind of cold forever," he said. Ruth didn't answer that. Instead, she said something else. "Sir, I'm not asking for special treatment," she said. "I just need a little time. I'll find another job. I always do." Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she stood straight even when she was clearly exhausted, at the way she never once asked him for money, at the way she kept saying "sir" even though he was the man whose company had just taken away her paycheck. "What if you didn't do anything wrong?" Daniel asked. Ruth looked confused. "Sir? What if staying home with your sick child was not a mistake?" he said. "What if the mistake was somewhere else?" Ruth didn't answer. She looked down at her hands, then at her daughter, who was standing quietly near the wall, listening to every word. "Sir," Ruth said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "people like me don't get to decide where the mistake is. We just deal with it." That sentence stayed in the room for a long time. Daniel nodded once, almost to himself. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the table next to the stack of job applications. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I want you to come to this address. Ask for Claire Bennett. Tell her I sent you." Ruth looked at the card but didn't pick it up yet. "Sir, I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," Daniel said. "This is a conversation." She hesitated. "About what?" "About what really happened when you lost your job," he said. Ruth finally picked up the card and looked at it like it was something fragile. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Daniel thought about the church parking lot, about the empty tables, about the banner with his name on it, about a little girl standing in the cold asking for a coat she would never wear herself. He looked at Ruth and answered honestly. "Because your daughter asked me for a coat," he said, "and I think she was really asking me for something else." When Daniel and Vanessa finally stepped back into the cold hallway, Ruth stood in the doorway holding the business card like it might disappear if she didn't keep her fingers on it. "Tomorrow morning," Daniel said again. 9 o'clock. Don't be late." "I won't," Ruth said quietly. The little girl stood beside her mother, looking from Daniel to the card and back again, trying to understand what had just happened and whether it was something good. Daniel nodded once, then turned and walked down the hallway. Vanessa followed him without speaking. The driver was already waiting at the bottom of the stairs, the SUV engine running, warm air spilling into the night when he opened the door. They got in, and the car pulled out of Maple Court without anyone saying a word. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of the engine and the low hum of the heater. The city lights grew brighter again as they left the darker streets and moved back toward downtown. Vanessa was the first to speak. "You're getting involved," she said, not looking at him. "I can tell." Daniel looked out the window. "I'm looking into a termination case. That's not unusual." "You didn't drive a terminated employee's child home last week," Vanessa replied. "Or the week before." Daniel didn't answer. Vanessa turned slightly toward him. "You can't fix every unfair thing that happens in a company that size. That's why there are departments, procedures, policies." "And if the policies are wrong?" Daniel asked quietly. Vanessa didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was softer. "Policies are what keep things from turning into chaos. If managers start making emotional decisions, the whole system breaks." Daniel thought about the apartment, about the broken zipper, about the stack of job applications lined up neatly on a kitchen table. "I don't think staying home with a sick child is chaos," he said. Vanessa sighed and looked out her own window. You're not thinking like a CEO right now. No, Daniel said. I'm not. They didn't talk for the rest of the drive. By the time Daniel arrived at the downtown hotel, the fundraiser had already started. Through the tall glass windows, he could see people in dark suits and evening dresses holding wine glasses and smiling under soft golden lights. A large sign near the entrance read, Whitmore Foundation Winter Gala. He stood in the lobby for a moment before going in, looking at his own name printed in gold letters. An hour earlier, he had been standing in a dim hallway looking at a woman who was trying to figure out how to keep her children warm after losing her job. Now he was supposed to walk into a room where people would applaud him for helping the poor. For the first time in a long time, the distance between those two worlds made him uncomfortable. Claire Bennett spotted him as soon as he entered the ballroom and walked over quickly, tablet in hand. "You're late," she said quietly, but without judgment. "The Petersons are here, and the mayor already asked where you were." "I had something to take care of," Daniel said. Claire studied his face for a second. She had worked for him long enough to know when something had shifted. "Does this have anything to do with why you asked me to be in the office early tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "I want you to pull the full file on an employee named Ruth." He paused. Realizing he didn't know her last name, he thought for a moment. "Ruth from Plant 4, terminated this week for attendance." Claire made a note immediately. "All right. I also want the attendance records for her department, the supervisor reports, and the termination authorization," Daniel added. "And everything connected to Gerald Pike." Claire looked up from the tablet. "Gerald Pike? Floor operations?" "Yes." Claire nodded slowly. "That's specific." Daniel glanced across the room at the donors laughing near the stage. "So is firing someone who stayed home with a sick child." Claire didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded once. "I'll have everything on your desk in the morning." "Thank you," Daniel said. He walked toward the stage when someone signaled that it was time for his speech. The room quieted as he stepped up to the microphone. The lights were bright enough that he couldn't see the back of the room clearly. Only rows of faces turned toward him, waiting for him to say something inspiring. He had given versions of this speech many times, about opportunity, about responsibility, about community. He looked down at the printed notes in front of him, then back up at the audience. "Tonight," he began, "we're here to talk about helping people through the winter." He paused, and for a brief moment he saw not the ballroom, but a small apartment with a broken zipper and a kitchen table covered in job applications. "We like to think that winter is the problem," he continued slowly. "That if we give out enough coats and blankets, then we've done what we came to do." The audience listened politely, quietly. "But sometimes," Daniel said, "the real problem isn't the cold. It's how easy it is for someone to fall out of the system and no one notices until they're standing in the cold asking for a coat." That wasn't the speech that had been printed for him. Claire, standing near the side of the room, looked up from her tablet. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the sides of the podium. "A company," he said, "is not just buildings and machines and numbers. It's people. And if the people who work for you are one bad week away from losing everything, then something in that system is broken. And if you're the person whose name is on the building, then that problem belongs to you whether you want it or not." The room was very quiet now. Daniel finished the speech without looking at his notes again. When he stepped down, people still applauded. They always did, but the applause sounded different to him now, like it was meant for someone he was no longer sure he was. Later that night, when the event was over and the lights in the ballroom were being dimmed, Daniel stood alone near the window overlooking the city. He took his phone out and opened his email. There were dozens of messages waiting. Invitations, reports, numbers, schedules. He opened a new message instead and typed a single line to Claire. "Make sure she comes in tomorrow, no matter what." He stared at the message for a moment before hitting send. Somewhere across the city, in a small apartment near the factory, a woman was probably putting her children to bed and setting her alarm early so she wouldn't miss a meeting that might be her last chance. Daniel put his phone back in his pocket and looked out at the lights of the city. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about profit or expansion or the next deal. He was thinking about a little girl standing in the cold, asking for a coat she would never wear herself, and he understood that tomorrow morning was not going to be a normal day. The next morning came cold and clear. the kind of hard Michigan morning where the air looked clean but felt like glass in your lungs. Ruth had been awake since before sunrise. She had ironed her only good shirt the night before and hung it on the back of the kitchen chair so it wouldn't wrinkle. The coat with the broken zipper lay across the couch, and she spent a long time looking at it before putting it on anyway. She brushed her daughter's hair, packed a small lunch, and wrote a phone number on a piece of paper in case something went wrong and she didn't come back on time. "Stay inside after school," she told her daughter. "And make sure your brother drinks his medicine." "Are you going to get your job back?" the girl asked. Ruth paused. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I'm going to talk to someone." She didn't say who. She didn't say where. Saying it out loud might make it disappear. She left early because she didn't trust the bus to be on time. The bus stop bench was cold, so she stood instead. Her arms held close to her body inside the thin coat. People came and went, a man in work boots, a woman in scrubs, two teenagers with headphones, everyone quiet in the morning cold. When the bus came, she sat near the front and watched the city change through the window. The buildings got taller, the streets cleaner, the people better dressed. By the time she got off near the Whitmore Logistics regional office, she felt like she had stepped into a place where she didn't quite belong. The building was all glass and steel, reflecting the pale winter sun. People walked in carrying leather bags and coffee cups that probably cost more than her lunch for the week. She stood across the street for a full minute before crossing, just looking at the name on the building, Whitmore Logistics. She pulled the business card out of her pocket and read the name again. Claire Bennett. Inside, everything was quiet, in the way expensive places were quiet. Soft floors, soft lighting, people speaking in low voices. The receptionist looked up and gave her a polite smile that didn't quite hide the quick up and down glance at her coat. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked. Ruth placed the card on the desk carefully. "I'm here to see Miss Bennett. Mr. Whitmore asked me to come." The receptionist's expression changed slightly when she heard the name. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly for a moment, then nodded and hung up. "Please have a seat," she said. "Someone will come get you." Ruth sat in a chair that was softer than anything in her apartment and held her purse on her lap with both hands so she wouldn't touch anything she wasn't supposed to. Upstairs, Daniel Whitmore was already in his office, reading through a file Claire had placed on his desk an hour earlier. Attendance reports, shift logs, termination authorization forms, supervisor notes. Ruth Carter. Employed 3 years, 8 months. 2 prior late arrivals. No prior disciplinary action. Terminated for unexcused absence. 2 consecutive days. Daniel flipped to the supervisor log. Night shift supervisor, Tanya Brooks. Note entered. Employee called to report child illness. Message recorded. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He turned the page. Termination authorization, Gerald Pike. Reason, attendance policy violation. Replacement already hired. Claire stood across from his desk, tablet in hand. "I pulled everything I could find," she said, "including payroll and departmental attendance patterns." "And?" Daniel asked. Claire tapped the screen and turned it toward him. "In the last 6 months, Pike has terminated 9 employees for attendance violations." "That doesn't sound unusual for a plant that size," Daniel said. Claire nodded. "It would be normal, except 7 of those 9 were single parents. 5 of them were out for child illness." Daniel looked up at her. "And before you ask," Claire continued, "yes, I checked. In 3 of those cases, the employee had called in and the supervisor logged it, but Pike still marked it as unexcused." Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly. "Has anyone complained?" he asked. 2 did, Claire said. HR reviewed the cases and sided with management both times. Policy compliance. Daniel gave a small, humorless smile. Policy compliance. That's a useful phrase. Claire didn't smile back. "There's more. Pike also reduced winter overtime hours this year, which means lower seasonal income for that department." "Why?" Daniel asked. "Official reason. Cost control." "And unofficial?" Daniel asked. Claire held his gaze. "Unofficially, it makes it easier to replace people who can't afford to miss hours." There was a knock on the door. Claire turned. "That's probably her." "Send her in," Daniel said. Ruth stepped into the office slowly, holding her purse in both hands. She stopped just inside the door, unsure how far she was supposed to go. Daniel stood up from behind his desk. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, sir," she said. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Please, sit down." She sat carefully, her back straight, her coat still on. Daniel sat down again and opened the file in front of him. "I read your employment record this morning," he said. "You worked at Plant 4 for almost 4 years. Yes, sir. You were rarely late. You picked up extra shifts. Your supervisor notes say you were reliable." "Yes, sir," she said quietly. He turned the file so she could see one of the pages. "This note here," he said. "It says you called in the night your son got sick. Is that true?" "Yes, sir. I called before my shift started." "And you spoke to Tanya Brooks?" "Yes, sir." Daniel nodded once. "Then you did follow procedure," he said. Ruth looked at him, confused, as if she didn't understand where this was going. "Mr. Pike said I still missed too many hours," she said carefully. "He said the company can't run on feelings." Daniel closed the file slowly. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I don't think this is about feelings." Ruth sat very still, waiting. "I think this is about whether the rules are being used the way they were meant to be used," Daniel said. "Or whether they're being used to make certain people easier to replace." Ruth didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked one quiet question. "Sir, am I in trouble for coming here?" Daniel looked at her for a moment before answering. "No," he said. "You're not in trouble." He paused, then added, "But someone might be." Ruth did not know what to do with that answer. She sat in the chair across from Daniel Whitmore's desk, her hands folded around her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She had expected many things when she walked into that building: embarrassment, maybe a lecture about company policy, maybe a polite explanation that nothing could be done. She had not expected the owner of the company to look at her like a problem that needed to be solved. Daniel closed the file and slid it to the corner of his desk. "I'm going to ask you a few more questions," he said. "I need you to answer as clearly as you can. Not what you think the company wants to hear. Just the truth. All right?" "Yes, sir," Ruth said. "When you called in about your son being sick, what exactly did you say?" "I said he had a high fever and I needed to stay home with him," she said. "I asked if I could take an unpaid day. I told Tanya I would bring a doctor's note if they needed one." "And what did she say?" "She said she would write it down and let Mr. Pike know," Ruth said. "She told me to take care of my boy." Daniel nodded slowly. That matched the note in the file. "When you came back to work, what happened?" he asked. "I worked 2 more shifts," Ruth said. "Then they called me into the office and told me I was being terminated for unexcused absence." "Did you tell them you had called in?" "Yes, sir, I told them." Mr. Pike said there was no record of approval and that policy is policy. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Did he say anything else?" Daniel asked. Ruth hesitated. "You can say it," Daniel said. "You're not going to lose anything by telling the truth now." Ruth looked down at her hands before answering. "He said if he made exceptions for people with kids, he'd have to make exceptions for everyone. He said the company can't be run around people's personal problems." Daniel didn't react, but Claire, standing off to the side, wrote something down quickly. Ruth continued quietly. "He said if I couldn't find someone to watch my child, then maybe I shouldn't be working full-time." The room went very still. Daniel turned his chair slightly toward the window for a moment, looking down at the street far below. People moved along the sidewalk in heavy coats, coffee cups in their hands, heading into buildings where heat and paychecks were steady things. Then he turned back. "Thank you," he said. "You did the right thing coming here today." Ruth let out a small breath, like she had been holding it since she walked into the building. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel looked at Claire. "Is Mr. Pike in the building today?" Claire checked her tablet. "Yes, he's scheduled for the regional operations meeting at 10. Daniel looked at the clock on his wall. 9:18 a.m. "Good," he said. "Call him. Tell him I want to see him before that meeting." Claire nodded and stepped out of the office. Ruth's eyes widened slightly. "Sir, you don't have to do that. I don't want to cause trouble." Daniel looked at her carefully when he answered. "Mrs. Carter, do you know how many people work for this company?" She shook her head. "No, sir. Thousands," he said. "Which means I don't get to see most of what happens in places like Plant 4. I rely on reports, numbers, managers, paperwork." He paused, then added quietly, "But sometimes paperwork doesn't tell the whole story." Ruth nodded slowly, though she still looked worried. "I don't want anyone to get in trouble because of me," she said. Daniel's voice was calm when he replied, "If someone gets in trouble because they broke the rules, that's not because of you." There was a knock on the door, and Claire stepped back in. "Mr. Pike is on his way up." Ruth immediately started to stand. "I should go." "No," Daniel said. "I want you to stay." Her eyes widened. "Sir, I can't sit in a room with my manager. That's not how this works." Daniel folded his hands on the desk. "It is today." A few minutes later, there was another knock, firmer this time. "Come in," Daniel said. Gerald Pike walked into the office like a man who had been in management long enough to be comfortable in any room. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a company jacket with his name embroidered on the chest. He stopped when he saw Ruth sitting in the chair. His expression changed for just a fraction of a second before settling back into professional calm. "Mr. Whitmore," Pike said. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Close the door, Gerald." Pike closed the door and remained standing. Daniel gestured toward the chair beside Ruth. "Sit down." Pike sat, but his eyes moved once toward Ruth, sharp and questioning. "I was reviewing some termination files this morning," Daniel said, opening the folder again. "One of them caught my attention. Ruth Carter, terminated this week for unexcused absence." Pike nodded once. "Yes, sir. Attendance violation. We've had to tighten enforcement this quarter." "I see," Daniel said. "According to this file, she called in to report a child illness." Pike didn't miss a beat. There was no formal approval for leave. Policy requires coverage arrangements and documentation. Daniel turned the file around and tapped the supervisor note with his finger. The night supervisor logged the call. Pike glanced at the paper. "Logging a call isn't the same as approving an absence," he said. "If we start bending rules for one person, we have to bend them for everyone. Then we don't have a policy anymore." Ruth sat very still, looking at the floor. Daniel watched Pike carefully. "How many people have you terminated for attendance in the last 6 months, Gerald?" Pike shrugged slightly. "I don't have the exact number in my head. Maybe 8 or 9. 7 of them were single parents," Daniel said. 5 were out because of child illness. For the first time, Pike didn't answer immediately. "We run a business," Pike said finally. "Not a daycare. If people can't show up, we have to replace them. That's how factories work." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm. "Factories work because people show up," Daniel said. "But they also work because people believe they're being treated fairly." Pike met his gaze evenly. "Fair doesn't keep a production line moving, sir. Rules do." Daniel held his eyes for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I think we're going to find out which one matters more." Gerald Pike did not look like a man who believed he was about to lose an argument. He sat back in the chair across from Daniel's desk, one ankle resting on his opposite knee, hands folded loosely, the posture of someone who had spent 20 years inside the same system and knew exactly how far he could push without crossing a line that actually mattered. "With respect, sir," Pike said, "attendance policy is written in black and white. If we start making exceptions because someone has a hard story, we won't have a workforce we can rely on." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He opened the folder again and slid several printed sheets across the desk toward Pike. "These are the last 9 attendance terminations from your department," Daniel said. "I asked for them this morning." Pike glanced down at the papers but didn't pick them up right away. "Then you already know I've been enforcing policy." Daniel nodded once. "Yes, I know you've been enforcing something." That sentence hung in the room for a second longer than was comfortable. Ruth sat very still in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had not looked up since Pike walked into the room. Daniel tapped one of the papers with his finger. 7 of these employees are single parents. 5 of the absences were related to a sick child. In 3 of those cases, the night supervisor logged a call before the shift started, and in all 3 cases, the absence was still marked unexcused. Pike picked up the papers now and looked at them briefly, then set them back down. "Logging a call is not the same as approving leave," Pike said. "You know that." If we don't enforce the difference, we lose control of the schedule. Then the line stops. Then we lose money. Then we lay off more people. That's how it works. Claire spoke for the first time since Pike had entered the room. Except the schedule didn't collapse, she said. I checked production numbers for those weeks. Output stayed within normal range. Pike looked at her, then back at Daniel. With respect, Miss Bennett, production stayed normal because we replaced people who couldn't commit to the schedule. Ruth flinched slightly at the word replaced, but she still didn't look up. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. Gerald, he said, how long have you worked for this company? 22 years, Pike said immediately. So you were there when my father was still running operations, Daniel said. Yes, sir. And what was the one thing he used to say about plant management? Daniel asked. Pike didn't answer right away. Then he said a plant runs on people, not machines. Daniel nodded. That's right. He also said if you treat people like parts, they'll leave the first time someone offers them a better deal. Pike shrugged slightly. Times are different now. Labor is replaceable. The system has to be consistent. The system also has to be fair, Daniel said. Pike met his gaze. Fair is subjective. Policy isn't. Daniel let that sit for a moment. Then he opened another folder Claire had prepared. This is winter overtime allocation, Daniel said. Your department cut overtime hours by 12% this quarter. Yes, Pike said. Cost control. Daniel turned the page and slid it toward him. And this is the winter assistance budget for plant employees. Coat vouchers, heating assistance, emergency leave coverage. That budget also went down this quarter. Pike's jaw tightened slightly. We had to make adjustments. Where did the money go? Daniel asked. Pike didn't answer immediately. Claire spoke again, calm and precise. The funds were reallocated to the Whitmore Foundation Winter Charity Drive. Same quarter, same amount, almost to the dollar. Ruth finally looked up at that. Pike exhaled slowly. That decision came from regional finance. The foundation event has a bigger impact, better visibility, better for the company long term. Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking at Pike in a way that made the room feel smaller. So let me understand this, Daniel said. We cut winter assistance for our own employees so we could give coats away on camera. No one spoke. Outside the office window, a truck moved slowly down the street far below. Its shape reflected in the glass behind Pike's shoulder. That's not how I would phrase it, Pike said carefully. That's exactly how I would phrase it, Daniel replied. The room went quiet again. Ruth's eyes moved between the two men, like she had walked into a conversation that was much bigger than her and didn't know where to stand. Pike cleared his throat. Sir, with respect, we are running a business, not a charity for employees who can't meet attendance requirements. Daniel's voice stayed calm, but there was something colder under it now. No, Daniel said. We are running a business, and that business depends on people who stand on a factory floor for 10 hours a day so the rest of us can sit in offices and talk about policy. Pike didn't look away. And if those people don't show up, the business fails. And if those people believe the system is rigged against them, Daniel said, the business fails anyway, just slower. Claire stepped closer to the desk and placed another document in front of Daniel. He glanced at it, then looked back at Pike. This is a report from HR, Daniel said. Exit interviews from your department. Do you know what the most common word is in these interviews? Pike didn't answer. Replaceable, Daniel said. That's the word employees used most often when describing how they felt working under your department. Pike gave a small shrug. Everyone is replaceable, sir. Even me. Even you. That's just reality. Daniel looked at him for a long moment after that. Then he said something very quietly. Reality is also that you don't get to decide on your own which rules matter and which people don't. Pike's expression hardened slightly. Are you saying I did something wrong? Daniel closed the folder in front of him. I'm saying, Daniel replied, that I think you used policy like a hammer, and you swung it hardest at the people who had the least ability to fight back. Pike's voice cooled. If you're going to run a company on sympathy, you won't have a company for long. Daniel stood up slowly from his chair. And if you run a company without any, he said, you won't deserve to have one. No one spoke after that. The silence in the room was heavy enough that Ruth could hear her own heartbeat. Daniel looked at Claire. I want a full audit of attendance enforcement at Plant 4 for the last 2 years. I want every termination reviewed where child illness was involved, and I want winter assistance funds restored to employee support immediately. Claire nodded. I'll start today. Pike stood up as well, his face now carefully blank. Is that all? Sir, Daniel looked at him. No, he said. That's not all. But it's where we're going to start. After Gerald Pike left the office, the room felt different, like the air itself had been holding its breath and was only now allowed to move again. Ruth was the first to speak, and her voice was careful, almost apologetic. Sir, I didn't mean to cause all this. Daniel looked at her, then closed the folder in front of him and rested his hands on the desk. You didn't cause this, he said. You walked into it. There's a difference. Ruth didn't look convinced. She still looked like someone who expected to be blamed when things went wrong, even if she didn't know exactly why. I just wanted my job, she said quietly. I wasn't trying to get anyone in trouble. Daniel nodded slowly. I know. Claire stepped forward slightly. Mrs. Carter, can you walk me through the day you were terminated? From the moment you arrived at work. Ruth nodded and sat up straighter, like she was back in a supervisor's office again. I came in for my shift, she said. Everything was normal. About an hour after I started, someone told me Mr. Pike wanted to see me. She paused, remembering. I went into the office. He was sitting behind the desk. There was a paper already printed out. He told me I had violated attendance policy, and they were letting me go. Just like that. Did he give you a chance to explain? Claire asked. I tried, Ruth said. I told him I called in. I told him my boy was sick. I told him I could bring a doctor's note. He said it didn't matter because the absence wasn't approved in the system. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Did he ask about your situation at all? Ruth shook her head. No, sir. He just said the company can't be run around people's personal lives. Claire wrote something down again. Did anyone from HR speak to you? Claire asked. No, ma'am, Ruth said. Just Mr. Pike. He had the paper. I signed it because I didn't know what else to do. Daniel looked up. You signed the termination form? Yes, sir, he said. It just meant I received the notice. Daniel leaned back in his chair again, thinking. Claire spoke carefully. Mrs. Carter, after you were terminated, did anyone talk to you about winter assistance? Coat vouchers? Emergency relief? Anything like that? Ruth looked confused. No, ma'am. I didn't know there was anything like that. Daniel and Claire exchanged a look. That program existed, Claire said quietly to Daniel. At least on paper. Daniel nodded once, then looked back at Ruth. What did you do after you left the plant that day? He asked. Ruth gave a small, tired smile. I went home so my kids wouldn't see me crying. The room went quiet again. Then the next morning I started looking for work. She continued. I filled out applications. I called a few places. Most of them said they'd call me back. She hesitated, then added, I didn't tell my kids right away. I didn't want them to worry. Daniel thought about the little girl standing in the church parking lot, asking for a coat she would never wear herself. They already knew, he said quietly. Ruth looked down at her hands. Kids always know. Claire closed her tablet gently. Mrs. Carter, I'm going to need you to sign a statement confirming what you told us today. It just says that you called in, that you were terminated without HR review, and that you were not informed about any assistance programs. Ruth looked nervous again. Am I allowed to sign something like that? Daniel answered. Yes, you are. And I won't get in trouble? She asked. No, Daniel said again. You won't get in trouble. Claire printed the statement from a small printer in the corner of the office and placed it on the desk with a pen. Ruth read slowly, moving her finger across each line before signing her name carefully at the bottom. Her handwriting was neat, like someone who had been taught that writing clearly was a sign of respect. When she finished, she slid the paper back toward Claire as if she were returning something important. What happens now? Ruth asked again. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city for a long moment before answering. Now we find out how many times this has happened, he said. He turned back toward her, and then we decide what to do about it. Ruth stood up slowly, holding her purse again. Sir, I don't know how to thank you. Daniel shook his head. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do, she said. Most people wouldn't even listen. Daniel thought for a moment, then said something unexpected. If you want to thank me, he said, then when you go home today, you tell your daughter something for me. Ruth looked surprised. What is it? Tell her, Daniel said, that I'm still looking for her coat. Ruth's eyes filled with tears for the first time since she had walked into the office, but she nodded. I will, she said. After she left, the office felt very quiet. Claire was the one who broke the silence this time. You know this isn't just about one manager, right? I know, Daniel said. If we dig into this, Claire continued, we're going to find more cases, more people, more mistakes. Daniel looked down at the signed statement on his desk. Then we dig, he said. Claire studied him for a moment. You're going to make enemies. Daniel gave a small, tired smile. I already have enemies. I just usually meet them in boardrooms. Claire almost smiled at that, but not quite. I'll start the audit, she said. Attendance records, termination patterns, HR responses, budget transfers. Everything. Daniel nodded. And Claire? Yes? Make sure winter assistance is reinstated immediately, quietly. I don't want a press release. I want coats in employees' lockers and heating bills paid before anyone writes a speech about it. Claire nodded once. Understood. She picked up her tablet and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. You know, she said, most executives would have just written that woman a check and felt good about themselves. Daniel looked back out the window again. Her daughter didn't ask me for money, he said. She asked me for a coat. He paused, then added quietly, those are not the same thing. When Ruth left the building, she walked out into the cold with the business card still in her pocket and something unfamiliar in her chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't hope either. It was something in between, something cautious and fragile. Like the first warm day after a long winter when you still keep your coat nearby because you don't trust the weather yet. She took the bus home and spent the entire ride staring at her hands, replaying every word from that office over and over in her mind, wondering if she had said too much, or not enough, or something wrong. At Plant 4, the morning shift had just ended when word began to spread that Mr. Pike had been called into a meeting upstairs with corporate. No one knew exactly why, but factories run on information the same way they run on electricity, always moving, always humming through the walls. Tanya Brooks heard first from a line supervisor who had seen Pike leave the floor earlier than usual. By lunch break, 3 different people had heard 3 different versions of the story. They're auditing attendance. They're cutting more hours. Corporate's looking for someone to blame for the overtime budget. Tanya didn't say anything. She just sat in the break room stirring powdered creamer into a paper cup of coffee that didn't taste like coffee. She knew why Pike had been called upstairs. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang. The caller ID showed the regional office number. She let it ring twice before answering. This is Tanya. Miss Brooks. This is Claire Bennett from Whitmore Logistics. The voice on the other end said. Calm. Professional. Not unkind. I'd like you to come in tomorrow morning to answer a few questions about attendance reporting procedures at Plant 4. Tanya stared at the vending machine across from her while she listened. Am I in trouble? She asked quietly. No, Claire said. But we need accurate information. And according to the records, you're the one who logged several employee call-ins that were later marked unexcused. Tanya closed her eyes for a moment. I wrote down every call I got, she said. Every single one. That's what we need to talk about, Claire replied. Can you come in at 9? Tanya thought about her rent, her car payment, her son's braces bill sitting on the kitchen counter. Yes, she said finally. I'll be there. Back at the regional office, Daniel stood in Claire's office looking at a whiteboard that was slowly filling with names and dates. 9 terminations in 6 months from the same department. 7 single parents. 5 child illness absences logged by the night supervisor. 3 employees who had filed complaints. 0 reversals. Claire capped the marker and stepped back. This isn't random, she said. This is a pattern. Daniel nodded. Yes, he's using the policy, Claire continued. But he's using it selectively. The people most likely to miss a shift, parents without backup childcare, are also the easiest to replace because they can't afford to fight back. Daniel crossed his arms, staring at the board. On paper, he looks efficient, Claire said. Low overtime, no schedule gaps, clean reports. And in reality? Daniel asked. In reality, Claire said. He's been quietly pushing out anyone whose life is complicated. Daniel thought about the word replaceable again. Set up meetings with the other terminated employees, Daniel said. I want to hear their stories directly. Claire nodded. HR won't like that. HR works for the company, Daniel said. And I'm trying to figure out what kind of company this is. Claire studied him for a moment, then said, There's one more thing. She handed him another document. What's this? Daniel asked. Eviction notice, Claire said. Ruth Carter. Maple Court Apartments, 3 days. Daniel looked up sharply. 3 days? She fell behind on rent the same week she lost her job, Claire said. If she doesn't pay or show proof of employment, they file for removal. Daniel looked down at the paper again. The date was stamped in red. 3 days. He thought about the small apartment, the drawings on the refrigerator, the little boy asleep on the couch, the girl standing in the church parking lot asking for a coat she would never wear. If she gets evicted, Claire said carefully, this stops being an employment issue and becomes a life issue. Daniel folded the paper slowly. Call Maple Court, he said. Tell them Whitmore Logistics is reviewing an employment dispute involving that tenant and we need 30 days before any action is taken. Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. That's going to raise questions. Let it raise questions, Daniel said. Just don't mention charity. Mention legal review. Claire nodded. Understood. She made a note, then looked back up at him. You know this is getting bigger. Daniel looked at the whiteboard again. At the list of names, at the pattern that was no longer possible to ignore. It was always bigger, he said. We just hadn't met it yet. That evening, when Ruth got home, her daughter ran to the door. What happened? The girl asked immediately. Ruth knelt down and hugged her, holding her a little longer than usual. I talked to the man I told you about, Ruth said. The one from the church? The girl asked. Yes. Did he find your coat? The girl asked. Ruth smiled, but her eyes were tired. Not yet. The girl thought about that, then nodded seriously like she understood something important. It's okay, she said. You can wear mine when I'm at school. Ruth pulled her into another hug, tighter this time, and closed her eyes. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore sat alone in his office long after most of the lights in the building had gone out, looking at a list of employees who had lost their jobs because life had asked them to choose between work and their children. On the corner of his desk sat a simple piece of paper with a red stamp. 3 days. Daniel looked at it for a long time, then picked up his phone and made another call. This is Whitmore, he said when the line connected. I need a full review of termination authority at Plant 4. Effective immediately, Gerald Pike does not sign off on another termination until I say so. He ended the call and sat there in the quiet office, the city lights reflecting in the window behind his desk. A few days ago, a little girl had asked him for a coat. Now he was beginning to understand that what she had really handed him was a thread, and if he kept pulling it, an entire system might start to come apart. The next morning, the factory floor at Plant 4 was louder than usual, but not because of the machines. People were talking, not openly, not in groups that would attract attention, but in pairs, in low voices near the time clock, in short sentences between the loading dock and the break room. They called Tanya to corporate. I heard Pike can't fire anyone right now. I heard they're reviewing terminations. Rumors moved fast in places where people didn't have much else to control except information. Gerald Pike walked across the factory floor with his usual steady pace, but he could feel the difference. Conversations stopped half a second too late when he passed. People looked down at their work a little too quickly. A line supervisor who normally joked with him in the morning just nodded and walked the other way. He went into his office and closed the door harder than he meant to. On his desk was an email from regional headquarters marked priority. Termination authority temporarily suspended pending review. Do not process further dismissals without executive approval. Pike read it twice, then leaned back in his chair and stared at the wall. 22 years. He had given this company 22 years. He had kept lines running, kept costs down, kept schedules tight. He had done exactly what management always said they wanted: efficiency, reliability, numbers that looked good in reports. And now corporate was digging through his department because of one woman who couldn't show up to work. He picked up the phone and dialed HR. "This is Pike," he said when someone answered. "How far is this review going to go?" The HR manager on the other end sounded careful. "As far as Mr. Whitmore wants it to." Pike's jaw tightened. "This is about that Carter woman, isn't it?" "It started there," the HR manager said. "But now they're looking at everything." Pike hung up without saying goodbye. Across town, Daniel was already in another meeting room with Claire and two people from legal and compliance. A stack of files sat in the center of the table. "This is bigger than one manager," the compliance officer said. "If we find a pattern of selective enforcement, the company could be exposed to wrongful termination claims." Daniel nodded. "Then we find the pattern before a lawyer does." Claire slid another file across the table. "We interviewed two of the former employees yesterday. Both told the same story. They called in. The supervisor logged it. Pike marked it unexcused anyway." "Did HR review those cases?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Claire said. "But HR only checked whether the policy allowed termination, not whether the policy was applied fairly." The lawyer spoke next. "That's the difference between legal and fair. Legal protects the company. Fair protects the people. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they're not." Daniel sat back in his chair. "I want them to be the same thing." The compliance officer gave a small nod. "Then you're going to have to change more than one manager." Daniel knew that already. Later that afternoon, Tanya Brooks sat in the same chair Ruth had sat in the day before, twisting a tissue in her hands. "I wrote down every call," she said for the third time. "Every time someone called in, I logged it. That was my job." Claire sat across from her. "We believe you. What we need to know is what happened after you logged it." Tanya hesitated, then looked at Daniel like she was trying to decide if he really wanted the truth. "Sometimes Mr. Pike would call me into the office at the end of the week," she said. "He'd have the attendance sheet. He'd ask which people called in for kid issues, or transportation issues, or things like that." "And then what?" Daniel asked. "He'd say those were reliability risks," Tanya said quietly. "He said if we didn't clean up reliability, corporate would start cutting shifts." "Did he ever tell you to change a record?" Claire asked. Tanya shook her head quickly. "No. He never said that. He'd mark the absence unexcused when the final report went in. Even if I logged the call." Daniel exchanged a look with Claire. "Did anyone ever question it?" Daniel asked. Tanya gave a small, sad smile. "People who work on factory floors don't question things like that if they want to keep working." That answer stayed in the room for a long time. When Tanya left, Claire closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "That's it," she said. "That's the pattern. He never changed the log. He changed the classification later. On paper, it looks clean. In reality, he was filtering people out." Daniel stood and walked to the window again, looking down at the city like he had the night before. "Filtering," he repeated quietly. "People with sick kids. People without backup childcare. People who couldn't afford to miss a shift," Claire said. "The people most likely to have complicated lives." Daniel nodded slowly. "The people with the least margin for error." Claire watched him for a moment. "What are you going to do?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "Set up a meeting tomorrow morning. Me, Pike, HR, legal, and bring the termination files." Claire nodded. "All of them?" "All of them," Daniel said. That evening, when Ruth got home, there was a letter taped to her apartment door. Her hands started shaking before she even took it down because she thought she already knew what it was. But when she opened it, the words were different from what she expected. "Notice of eviction review on hold. Pending employment verification." She read it twice, not fully understanding, then looked down at the bottom where a company name was printed in small letters. Whitmore Logistics Legal Department. Her daughter looked up at her. "Is it bad?" Ruth shook her head slowly, still staring at the paper. I don't think so." That night, after her children were asleep, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her and cried quietly. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time since she lost her job, everything was not getting worse. Across the city, Daniel sat in his office with a row of termination files spread across his desk. 9 names, 9 stories, 9 people who had been reduced to paperwork and policy codes. He closed the last file and leaned back in his chair, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with hours worked and everything to do with what he was beginning to see. A company could be profitable and still be cruel. A policy could be legal and still be wrong. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was a little girl who had asked him for a coat, and he was starting to understand that what she had really asked him to do was decide what kind of man he was going to be when no one was clapping. The meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but Gerald Pike arrived at 8:30. He did not sit in the waiting area. He stood near the window, hands in his jacket pockets, looking down at the street the way men do when they are trying to convince themselves they are still in control of a situation. At exactly 9, Claire opened the conference room door. "Mr. Pike," she said, "they're ready for you." Inside the room, Daniel sat at the head of the table. To his right was a woman from legal. To his left, a man from compliance. Claire sat near the end with a laptop open and a neat stack of folders arranged in front of her. Gerald Pike walked in, nodded once, and sat down. No one spoke for a moment. The silence was deliberate. Finally, Daniel slid a folder across the table. "Termination files," he said. "Last 6 months. Your department." Pike rested his hand on the folder but didn't open it. "I assume this is about attendance enforcement." "It is," Daniel said, "and about how policy is applied." Pike opened the folder and flipped through a few pages, more for show than because he needed to read them. He already knew what was in those files. "I followed company policy," Pike said. "Every termination in that file meets the written standard." The lawyer spoke calmly. "This meeting is not about whether the policy allows termination. It's about whether the policy was applied consistently and fairly." Pike leaned back slightly. "Fair is not a legal term." "No," the lawyer said. "But discrimination is. So is selective enforcement." The word hung in the air. Pike looked at Daniel. "Are you accusing me of discrimination?" "I'm saying," Daniel replied, "that 7 of the 9 people you terminated were single parents, and 5 were out because of a sick child. I'm saying the night supervisor logged those calls, and you marked them unexcused anyway. I'm saying you cut winter assistance hours while increasing public charity spending, and I'm asking you to explain why every one of those decisions seems to hurt the same kind of people." Pike didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm, but there was iron in it. "Because those are the people who miss work," he said. "That's the truth no one wants to say out loud." No one interrupted him. "You run a factory by reliability," Pike continued, "not by sympathy. People who have complicated lives miss shifts. When people miss shifts, lines slow down. When lines slow down, we lose contracts. When we lose contracts, we lay off more people. So yes, I remove unreliable workers. That's my job." Daniel watched him carefully. "You keep using that word. Unreliable. If someone can't come to work, they are unreliable," Pike said. "That's not personal." Claire spoke quietly. "Is a man unreliable if his car breaks down?" "No," Pike said. "That's bad luck." "Is a worker unreliable if he gets the flu?" she asked. "No. That's illness. But a mother is unreliable if her child is sick," Claire said. Pike looked at her directly. "A business cannot run on children's fevers." The compliance officer leaned forward slightly. "So your solution is to remove every parent who doesn't have perfect child care?" "My solution," Pike said, "is to keep the line running." Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Do you know what the difference is between you and me, Gerald?" he asked. Pike didn't answer. "You think your job is to protect the line," Daniel said. "My job is to protect the people who stand on it." Pike shook his head slightly. "With respect, sir, that's a nice thing to say in this room. But if you actually ran the plant that way, you'd be closing it in a year." Daniel held his gaze. "My father ran these plants for 30 years without firing single mothers for staying home with sick kids. Times were different." Pike said again. "No," Daniel said. "People were different." The room went very quiet. Pike leaned forward now, his voice lower. "You want the truth?" "The truth is, people like Ruth Carter are always one problem away from missing work. Sick kid, bus late, babysitter quits, rent due, always something. If you don't draw a hard line, the whole system bends until it breaks. Daniel didn't look angry. If anything, he looked more tired than anything else. And if you draw the line where only people with perfect lives can keep their jobs, Daniel said, then you don't have a workforce. You have a filter. Pike didn't deny it this time. Yes, he said. That's exactly what you have. A filter. And that's why the numbers look good. Claire closed one of the folders and folded her hands. There it is, she said quietly. Pike looked at her. There what is? You said the quiet part out loud, Claire replied. The lawyer spoke next, her tone still calm but now very precise. Mr. Pike, selective enforcement of policy that disproportionately targets a specific class of employees in this case. Single parents exposes the company to legal liability, especially when documented call-ins were reclassified as unexcused after the fact. Pike looked at Daniel again. So what is this? Are you firing me for doing exactly what every plant manager is pressured to do? Keep costs down and numbers clean? Daniel didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, I'm holding you responsible for how you chose to do it. Pike let out a short breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh, not quite anger. You think firing me fixes this? Pike asked. There are 10 more managers like me. Maybe worse. You built a system that rewards my numbers. I just played the game better than the others. Daniel nodded slowly. I believe that. That answer seemed to surprise Pike more than anything else that had been said. Daniel continued. Which means this isn't just about you. But you are the place where I start. Pike sat very still now. What does that mean? He asked. Daniel folded his hands on the table. It means, he said, that effective immediately, you are suspended pending formal review. Your termination cases are being reopened, and we are rewriting the attendance policy to include protected emergency family leave. Pike stared at him. You're going to slow down your own plants. I'm going to decide what kind of company this is, Daniel said. Pike stood up slowly. You do that, he said. But don't pretend you didn't know what was happening before this week. Daniel didn't look away. I knew numbers, he said. Now I know names. Pike held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once and walked out of the room without another word. After the door closed, no one spoke for a few seconds. Claire was the one who finally broke the silence. That's going to send a message, she said. Daniel looked down at the folders on the table, at the names printed in black ink across the tabs. It needs to, he said, because this story started with a coat, but it was never really about a coat. The news about Gerald Pike spread through Plant 4 before the afternoon shift even started. No official announcement had been made yet, but people saw things. They saw Pike leave the building with a folder under his arm and not come back. They saw HR walking the floor with clipboards. They saw Tanya Brooks speaking to someone from corporate near the loading dock, her hands shaking even though she was trying to look calm. Factories run on routine, and when routine changes, everyone feels it. By the end of the day, the word most people were using in quiet conversations wasn't fired, it was investigated. And that word felt different, heavier, like something important was happening somewhere behind closed doors. That evening, Ruth was at the kitchen table helping her daughter with spelling words when there was a knock on the apartment door. Her heart jumped immediately, because for weeks now every unexpected knock felt like bad news. She opened the door slowly. A man in a delivery jacket stood there holding a large paper bag and a long rectangular box. Delivery for Miss Carter, he said. Ruth frowned. I think you have the wrong apartment. I didn't order anything. The man checked the label. Whitmore Logistics, he said. It's already paid for. He handed her the bag and the box, nodded once, and left before she could ask anything else. Ruth closed the door and set the items on the kitchen table. Her daughter climbed down from the chair and came closer. Eyes wide. What is it? She asked. I don't know, Ruth said. She opened the paper bag first. Inside were groceries, real groceries, not just canned food. Milk, eggs, bread, chicken, rice, fresh vegetables, a box of cereal, a bottle of children's medicine, and a pair of thick winter gloves. Ruth's hand moved slowly over the items like she couldn't quite believe they were real. Then she opened the long box. Inside was a winter coat. It was dark blue, simple, heavy, with a strong zipper and deep pockets. Not fancy, not showy, just warm. The kind of coat someone could wear to a bus stop at 6 in the morning and not feel the wind cutting through to their bones. Her daughter touched the sleeve. "Is that yours?" she whispered. Ruth nodded slowly, her throat tight. "I think so." There was a small envelope in the box. Ruth opened it and found a single card inside. No logo. No long message. Just one sentence typed on white paper. For the bus stop, Ruth sat down in the kitchen chair very slowly, holding the card in her hand, and for the first time in a long time, she cried without trying to hide it. Across the city, Daniel was still in the office with Claire and the legal team. The files were now stacked in 2 piles instead of 1. "What about Ruth Carter specifically?" Claire asked. "Her termination was clearly processed without proper review." The lawyer nodded. "We can reverse the termination, reinstate employment with back pay for the missed weeks." Daniel nodded once. "Do it." "And the others?" Claire asked, looking at the second pile. Daniel looked at the names. Some were men, some were women. Some had worked there for years, some less than 1. All of them had a note in their file about attendance, about reliability, about policy. "We review each one," Daniel said. "Individually. If they were treated unfairly, we fix it. That's going to cost money," the compliance officer said. Daniel looked at him. "So does being the kind of company that throws people away when their kid gets sick." No one argued with that. Claire closed one of the folders and leaned forward slightly. "There's something else you should know," she said. "Word is spreading at the plant. People know something is happening." Daniel nodded. "Good. You don't sound worried," she said. "I'm not worried about people knowing we're fixing something that's broken," Daniel replied. "I'm worried about how long it was broken before I noticed." He stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the city lights coming on one by one as evening settled in. "When I was a kid," he said, not turning around, he'd walk the floor and shake hands with the guys coming off night shift. Claire listened quietly. "He knew their names," Daniel continued. "Not all of them, but enough that people felt like they weren't invisible." He turned back toward the table. "Somewhere along the way," he said, "we stopped being a company that knew people's names and became a company that knew their numbers." Claire didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked, "What are you going to do when the board asks why profits are down next quarter because of these changes?" Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "I'm going to tell them profits aren't the only thing that can be down. So can morale. So can loyalty. So can the number of people who believe this is a place worth giving 10 years of their life to." He picked up Ruth's file from the table and closed it. "And I'm going to tell them," he added quietly, "that all of this started because a little girl asked me for a coat." Claire looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Then we should probably make sure she gets one," she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. "She already has one," he said. "She just gave it to her mother." The first snow of the year came quietly. It started sometime before dawn, falling in thin, soft lines that covered the streets, the parked cars, the sidewalks, and the broken pavement of Maple Court in a clean layer of white that made everything look gentler than it really was. Ruth stood at the bus stop that morning wearing the new coat. It fit her perfectly, warm, heavy, with deep pockets and a zipper that closed all the way to her chin. She still kept her arms close to her body out of habit, but she was no longer shaking while she waited for the bus. 2 other women stood at the stop with her. One of them glanced at the coat and smiled. "That's a good one," the woman said. "Warm enough for Michigan." Ruth smiled back. "Yes, ma'am, it is." The bus came, and when Ruth stepped on, the driver nodded at her like he saw her every day, like she was just another person going to work on a cold morning. And that was all she had wanted in the first place, to be just another person going to work. At Whitmore Logistics Regional Office, Daniel stood in the lobby waiting. When Ruth walked in, she almost didn't recognize him at first because he wasn't behind a desk or standing on a stage. He was just standing there in a dark coat, holding a folder in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other, like any other man waiting for someone. "Good morning," he said when she walked up. "Good morning, sir," she replied. He nodded toward the elevator. "Walk with me." They rode up to the same floor as before. But this time, Daniel didn't take her to the conference room. He took her into his office. Claire was already there, along with someone from HR. Ruth stopped just inside the door. her hands tightening around her purse again. Daniel walked around his desk but didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against the edge of it, facing her directly. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "We reviewed your termination. It should not have happened the way it did." Ruth didn't move. She didn't speak. She just listened. "We are reversing the termination," Daniel continued. "You will be reinstated at Plant 4 starting Monday. Same position, same seniority, and you will receive back pay for the weeks you missed." Ruth stared at him, not fully understanding at first, like the words were in a language she hadn't learned yet. I have my job back?" she asked slowly. "Yes," Daniel said. Her hand moved to the back of the chair in front of her, like she needed something to hold on to. "And there's something else," Claire said gently. "The company is adding an emergency family leave policy. If a child is sick and a parent calls in properly, that absence can't be used as grounds for termination." Ruth looked from Claire to Daniel, her eyes filling again. "That's because of me?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No. That's because it should have been there already." Ruth let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped inside her chest for weeks. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what else to say." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is one more thing." Ruth looked up again, suddenly nervous. Daniel walked around the desk and handed her a small envelope. She opened it slowly. Inside was a simple employee badge with her name on it and a printed letter. She read the letter silently. When she finished, she looked up, confused again. "It says, Shift Supervisor Training Program," she said. "Sir, I'm not a supervisor." "Not yet," Daniel said. "But you've been doing the job of a responsible person for a long time. We'd rather promote people who understand what responsibility actually looks like." Ruth didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded, because if she tried to speak, she was going to cry again. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove out to Maple Court himself. He didn't bring a camera. He didn't bring anyone from the foundation. Just himself. The little girl was sitting on the steps outside the building when he pulled up, drawing shapes in the thin layer of snow with a stick. She looked up when she saw him and stood quickly. "Sir," she said. Daniel walked over and crouched down slightly so he was at her eye level again, just like the first day in the church parking lot. "I have an update," he said. She looked at him very seriously, waiting. "Your mama is going back to work on Monday," he said. Her eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes. And she got a new coat," he added. The girl smiled at that. A real smile this time. The kind children have when they can finally stop being brave for a while. "Thank you," she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do," she said. "Because you listened." Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "You know, when you asked me for a coat, I thought you were asking me for something simple." The girl tilted her head. "I was." Daniel smiled a little. "Yeah," he said. "You were." He stood up and looked around the apartment complex, the cracked pavement, the metal railings, the windows with thin curtains, the place where people lived when they were trying very hard not to fall behind. "Your mama told me something," Daniel said, looking back down at her. "She said people like her don't get to decide where the mistake is. They just deal with it." The girl was quiet, listening. "Well," Daniel said, "she was wrong about that." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pair of small, warm gloves and handed them to her. "For walking to school," he said. She took them carefully, like they were something important. "Sir," she said. "Yes? Did you find the coat you were looking for?" she asked. Daniel thought about the factory, the files, the meeting room, the policy changes, the long nights in his office, the way one small question had pulled a thread that unraveled something much bigger than he expected. Then he looked at the little girl standing in front of him in the cold, holding a pair of gloves that fit in the palm of his hand. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I did." The snow kept falling, soft and steady, covering the ground, the roads, the rooftops, and all the hard things people had been carrying alone for too long. This story carries a quiet but powerful lesson. Sometimes people are not asking for charity. They are asking for fairness. The little girl did not ask the billionaire for money, and she did not ask for a coat for herself. She asked for dignity for her mother, a woman who worked hard, followed the rules, and still lost everything because life forced her to choose between her job and her child. The story reminds us that real kindness is not just giving things away when people are watching. Real kindness is paying attention, listening, and having the courage to fix what is wrong, even when it is part of your own system. In the end, the coat was not just something to keep a person warm in the winter, it became a symbol of respect, responsibility, and justice. And the lesson is simple but important. Sometimes the smallest voices are the ones that show us the biggest truths. And one act of listening can change not just one life, but many. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.